Before we get into this SciShow talk show with Victoria Orphan, one of this year's MacArthur Genius Fellows, we wanted to thank the MacArthur Foundation for introducing us to Victoria and helping set up this conversation. You can learn more about the MacArthur Foundation in the description below. They do a bunch of really cool stuff. You can check them out. Hello, welcome to the SciShow talk show where we talk to interesting people about interesting things. Today we're talking to Victoria Orphan, geobiologist at CalTech and microbiologist. So geobiology, I assume, is the study of living rocks.
Well, so geobiology can be more broadly defined than that. So geobiology is really trying to understand how organisms have been shaped by and shape the chemical and physical environment, both today and also throughout Earth's history. And so partly what we do is detective work to try to piece together how things have changed over time. And a lot of the work that I do is looking at environments, active environments today, and pull together clues from these environments and specifically how microorganisms affect chemistry and physical processes in a way that can be translated to interpretation of signatures that exist in old materials.
Okay, so you're looking at like current processes and seeing how like things that happened a long time ago might have been caused by those processes that we don't understand very well.
That's correct, yeah.
The thing that fascinates me about your work and the Earth is that I have this sort of idea of what Earth looks like, of what life on Earth looks like. And for me, it's like a forest with some trees, and there's a bunch of stuff in the leaf litter, and there's plants, and there's bugs, and there's fungus, and there's microorganisms. But of course, land, even having that be land, is a huge, is the minority of the space on Earth. And then you have all of the ocean, which unlike land, where you can live just on it, the ocean you could live at any point on the, inside of it. And then you have the bottom of the ocean where, when I was watching a video of some of the work that you're doing, I was just like, oh, look at all that life down there. All those little that I never think about that are just covering the entire ocean floor. And so obviously it makes sense that they would have a tremendous impact on the sort of composition of our planet. So what is that impact that they're having, and how do you figure that out? How do you study it? And what does it mean for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing question. So if you
Sorry, I asked too many questions at once. I do that all the time. I should focus.
Yeah. So if you look from space at Earth, right, it doesn't escape people's attention that most of the Earth is ocean, right? Mm-hmm. Far greater than 70%. But really what you don't see is this amazing topography. You're only seeing the surface of the ocean, and it's really one of the last greatest unexplored frontiers on our planet. And scientists have maybe studied far less than maybe 5% of the seafloor, and there's tremendous life, not only in terms of diversity of weird organisms that have adapted to the extreme pressures and cold temperatures of the deep sea, but also, as you mentioned, they're playing important roles in the chemistry of our planet and in ways that we're just now beginning to try to unpack and understand. And so for me, part of my job is scientist in trying to understand how these organisms influence the chemistry of the deep ocean, but also I get to play explorer a little bit too in going to the deep sea and seeing these things firsthand.
Yeah. So have you been down there in the deep sea?
I have. Yes.
There's so much research to be done in the world, and it makes a lot of sense that we've explored so little of the ocean floor, because if I want to study some dirt, I just will go out and study some dirt. But if I want to study the bottom of the ocean, I got to get a submarine. Those things ain't cheap, I don't imagine.
They're not cheap. And we have a few of these manned submersibles so that actually bring humans to the deep sea firsthand, but there's also tremendous advancements in technology where you can have robots basically that are tethered to the ship, and everybody can sit in a giant control room that looks a lot like Star Trek, and you can watch on a big screen, high definition TV, the deep sea unfold in front of you. And so those kind of oceanographic experiences allows a lot of people to provide input into what they're seeing on the seafloor. And so it's much more collaborative type of science experience using these remotely operated vehicles.
That's pretty
and
cool.
Even more cool are these autonomous underwater vehicles, which look like giant torpedoes, basically, that are outfitted with all different kinds of physical and chemical sensors that they're sending off to map large swaths of the seafloor. So we're at a point now where we're learning a lot more about the ocean, and it's in a very exciting time. It's in a very important time for science in terms of looking at the links between how the ocean is influencing the rest of our planet.
So the ocean being the majority of our planet, what are the effects that you're studying? What are the microorganisms doing that down there that is like sort of important for me living my daily life?
So the process that we've been really fascinated by for over a decade is our organisms that consume methane in the deep sea. And the ocean's connection to methane is one that I think the general public doesn't typically think about, but there is a tremendous amount of methane that's stored in deep ocean sediments in ice form. So these things called methane hydrates.
Where is that coming from? Is that like old, like fossil fuel kind of methane, or is that being recently produced by microorganisms?
We don't actually have a good understanding of all of the sources that are contributing to these hydrates. It's likely old, but the chemistry of those hydrates suggests that some of it is biological, and we don't quite understand the time scale of production versus consumption.
Okay.
So they're giant, basically ice layers that are stabilized because of the cold temperatures in the deep sea and also the high pressures. So just like an ice would form from water when you increase the temperature, these methane ices also form under these cold temperatures as well.
And so there's stuff down there eating that methane, because as we know, methane contains energy. You can oxidize it and burn it and cook your noodles. So there are organisms that can sort of do that same thing to provide energy for themselves?
That's correct, yeah. And it's easy to turn on the stove, right, and light a flame, and it's really the oxygen in the air that allows this combustion to happen. And there are microorganisms that can eat methane with oxygen and gain that same kind of energy. However, the organisms that I study are even more remarkable in their sort of ability to gain energy, not from eating methane with oxygen, but actually they're using some of the salts in seawater, so sulfate that's found in seawater, as a way of gaining that energy. And it's kind of a very Spartan living, so you don't get a lot of energy out of that process, but these organisms have evolved ways to do this through symbiosis with other microorganisms. And so it's this sort of collaborative effort that allows them to consume methane quite effectively in the deep sea.
What's the byproduct of that reaction? What comes out? Is it just carbon dioxide, like if normal oxidation happened, or are we getting something weird?
So we get carbon dioxide, but we also have this other amazing process that converts that sulfate in seawater to hydrogen sulfide. So that same stuff that makes rotten eggs stink. And that hydrogen sulfide in itself is this very life-sustaining chemical for organisms in the deep sea. So lots of people have seen hydrothermal vent systems and these amazing deep sea worms and other organisms that live off of the chemistry in the deep sea. And a lot of that is this hydrogen sulfide. And these organisms have bacteria that use that hydrogen sulfide basically in a symbiosis. And we see the same thing happen in places where methane is being consumed through the sulfate reduction. And so you have these oases on the seafloor that are fueled through this process.
And it's an entirely methane fueled process. So theoretically, possibly, the methane originally came from some, surface of the Earth or some photosynthetic system, that sort of energy in the methane. But the system that you're talking about right now is entirely based on methane. So we could take that system off of the Earth into a place where there is no light, no energy except for the chemical energy in the methane in this system, not just the methane consumption, but the methane consumption and then the hydrogen sulfide consumption. As long as there was still methane, this biological system would continue to exist.
You'd have to have the methane plus an oxidant. So there'd
Right.
still have to be sulfate or some other thing. So we more recently have discovered that these methane consuming organisms also can use iron oxides too. So they can potentially grow with a solid mineral in addition to things that are dissolved in seawater. So it's a pretty remarkable buffet of things that they can eat combined with methane in the deep sea.
Cool. And obviously methane is important and like large sources of potential methane are important because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's a huge thing of concern. And so these organisms are basically helping that methane not escape to some extent. So understanding the system, how much of the methane escapes, especially I would assume, like are there processes that are increasing methane release in the seafloor right now?
Certainly in places like the Arctic, where you have permafrost and hydrates that are closer to the surface. There's been people who have gone up there to study. I haven't been up to the Arctic, but the reports are that there's increased methane vents being released, and some of this may be due to the destabilization and the warming that's happening in the seawater up there. And so, again, we don't have a good way to predict what the trajectory is going to be with these processes, but people are noticing there's increased methane gas coming out in certain areas of the Arctic.
So these microorganisms, do they eat the methane when it's still in the hydrate form, or does it need to be gaseous for them?
I believe it has to be dissolved in the water. However, people who have studied hydrates have found evidence of these microorganisms actually living in the hydrate matrix in some places. And so it's likely there's some fraction of that that's dissolved, and that's what they're feeding off of, rather than chewing on the solid substrate.
So you get a sample of the seafloor, you take that back to a lab, and then you figure out that they're like how this microorganism's like metabolism works. I have a hard time understanding how we figured out how we determined how our own metabolism works, let alone something happening in a tiny single cell that is very difficult to observe, and figuring out what the chemistry is going on in there. How are you doing this?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right? So we're studying things that are like the size of 1/200th of the length of your hair,
the
so
width
a
of my hair.
micron.
Yeah.
That lives, over a mile deep in the ocean, right? So there's a lot of technological challenges that go into even just collecting the sample. When we bring the sample back to lab, it's mud, right? And in that mud, you have billions of microorganisms that are all interacting in various ways. In the case of our system, we're looking at organisms that are tied to methane consumption. And so we can get information about these organisms through advances in molecular biology. So we can look at the genomes and the DNA of the organisms that live in that mud without growing them in the lab. So in classic microbiology, you can remember people would streak a Petri plate, and you would get colonies forming. It turns out if you do this in a lot of natural environments, you only capture less than 1% of the total diversity of microbes that are there. And so being able to look through the lens of their genomes gives us a much more comprehensive overview of the total organisms that are there. And once you have that information, then the question and the real challenge is what are all those organisms doing and how are they interacting with one another? And so this is where geobiology as a field really can offer some insights, and that is by taking tools that have been used in geochemistry and in geology and coupling them directly with this sort of genomic understanding of microorganisms. So we can look at who's there through their DNA, and then we can measure the geochemistry of those organisms directly by using techniques that have been refined in the field of geology and geochemistry. And so we look at chemical signatures in cells, and these chemical signatures tell us something about what they've been eating. And in some cases, we can follow the transfer of carbon from one organism to the next organism and sort of put together a food web of what's going on in the deep sea.
So you can see that symbiosis in action. You can see.
Right.
So you're basically looking at the products of reactions, and then from the products inferring what reactions are going on?
That's correct, yeah. And so in some cases, we can actually add in a chemical that, so we use these things called stable isotopes to do a lot of our work. And basically it just has a different, has one more neutron than the other, the common form of the isotope. And so we can add this into our sample and follow the organisms as they're consuming that. So if you add a carbon-13 labeled methane into your sample, you can follow its oxidation into CO2. You can follow it into the biomass of cells. And so from using this sort of detective work, we were able to see who's eating what and where its end products are going in the system.
So when I go to a swamp, it smells of eggs. Is this same kind of respiration going on in land systems?
You do find methane consumption, and if there is sulfate in these freshwater systems, it tends to be less than what you see in the marine environment. But you also can find methane coupled to things like nitrate, these iron oxides that we talked about, and oxygen as well.
Yeah. And I guess that it's sort of like in a swamp system, it would be required, because oxygen is so good at doing its job of oxidizing. It would be required that you have some system where all of the oxygen has been consumed for these alternate metabolites, I guess, to be produced. Well, that is neat. So you just got this Genius grant. Congratulations, you're a genius now. What do you do with your money?
That's a very good question. One that we've been asked quite a bit, and one that we're still. There's another MacArthur winner at CalTech who's a good friend of mine, and so she and I have been talking quite a bit about how to maybe sort of pool our collective resources in some way to do something even more substantial. But
cool.
I think both of us really strongly believe in education and trying to give back to the community. I think anybody in our position, if you ask, probably has been, tremendously influenced by mentors and teachers in our path that have helped us along our careers. And so we want to be able to provide those same kinds of opportunities for kids as well, and try to promote STEM sciences to young students and get them excited about this wonderful world of science and the environment around us.
Well, that is very cool. Congratulations. How does it feel?
It feels, of course, it's a wonderful thing. It's humbling to be selected. There are so many deserving people out there, and I feel incredibly fortunate to have this recognition, and I love sharing the the limelight with my fellow MacArthur class, and it's just been a really fun time to get to know all of these people. And,
yeah, that's another side benefit, is that now you're in this group and you get to hang out with others who have all done something really cool and interesting and useful for the world. Is there any immediate practical, like, I can be less worried about the environment now that I know that there's methane eaters covering the ocean floor?
I wish we could say that. I think it's the thing that I'm most hopeful about is the technology has come a long way in terms of our ability to understand natural ecosystems. And so from that standpoint, I think, projecting out 10 years, we might be at a point where we can start to do these forecasting models and understand what's going on and how these organisms are influencing our planet under different environmental conditions and changing climate.
Is it safe to say that, like, right now, like, seafloor methane is a big giant question mark in climate science? Like, we know that it's bad. We know that it's a potential huge positive feedback loop. Like, if methane starts to warm, like if the effect of methane starts to be significant on the warming, the effect of that seafloor release methane, then it's just going to cause more seafloor release methane. Then we're just in a giant cycle. So like, there is that concern that it could be much worse than we think, and we just don't have a good way of studying it yet.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that gives me pause is there's of course always interest and discussion of how do you harvest these hydrates as a fuel source, and it's this, we don't understand enough about the deep sea. I think of it as equivalent to just started clear cutting in the rainforest, and then after the fact realizing that there's all of this tremendous potential for medicine and all these things. We just have not invested enough in understanding the deep sea, and that baseline needs to be established before we start thinking about using it as a potential.
Well, it's hard enough on land to capture methane in a way that doesn't release a huge amount of it into the atmosphere. Like, that happens when we harvest methane on land. I can't imagine not losing, the majority at least of the methane if you're disturbing the seafloor. And then you're intentionally releasing, not intentionally, but like you are being the cause of the release of that methane into the atmosphere.
Yeah. We know there are periods in Earth history where there have been, predicted large methane responses, and we can see this sort of recorded in old sediment records and things. And so certainly, it's not unprecedented to have these massive releases of this greenhouse gas. And but yes, I agree. It would be better not to
start poking your own holes
without a better understanding of the system. Yeah.
Well, thank you for helping us get a better understanding of the system here for the people watching on SciShow, but also for all of Earthlings. We need a better understanding of the systems. So thanks for doing the great work, and keep it up. This is Victoria Orphan. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Hank. It was nice talking to you. Thanks.
Thank you to Victoria Orphan for sharing all your smarts with us. Thank you to the MacArthur Foundation for helping set this up. And thank you for watching. It's great to have you here, and we'll see you next time.
Sub-Saharan Africa. And, to sort of put it in perspective, if you look at the rates of newborn death in Malawi,